Hi, everyone. Christopher Wells from Piecemeal here. Very, very excited to have you with us for this new episode of Table 21 today. My guest is none other than Corey Phelps. And I say none other, you've probably never heard the name, but I like to bring people on that had, an impact on our industry, the food service industry, restaurants, or people that have had an impact on me and Piecemeal. So today it's more on that angle. Through the creation of Piecemeal 2 years ago, we did an accelerator in Montreal called Next AI. And one of the speaker teachers that came in to teach us is a gentleman by the name of Corey Phelps. Corey is now the dean of and I'm probably going to mess this up, of the Price Business School at the Oklahoma University. Before that, he was associated dean, strategy and entrepreneurship at McGill in Montreal, worked at HEC Paris, and I'll let him anyways introduce him. But there's probably two people in the last 10 years that had a huge impact on my career, my life, and Corey is one of them. So while he's not from our industry, he's an academic, he's worked with a lot of people, but he's taught me some great lessons that really had an impact on how I perceived our beautiful restaurant industry, tourism, and all that. So I wanted to have him come and tell us about some of the lessons he's seen, even with large companies and all that, but how we can apply that and use that today. So without any further ado, I'll bring him in right now. Hi, Corey. How are you?
Good, Chris. How you doing?
Very good. Again, thank you. I told you right before we started, but thank you for coming and doing this with us today. I'm very excited to have you here. Now, again, like I said, you're not from our industry. You're in a different world. You just moved from Montreal to Oklahoma. But I've always been fascinated by even your personal story because you've traveled and you got to even the academic game a little later in life and all that. So I'll let you, I'm sure you can say it 10 times better than me, but can you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to where you are today?
Sure. So first off, again, thanks for the opportunity to talk on the show. My background is we're going to play a bit of geographic hopscotch. So I grew up in Montana in Billings, and then like most people, when I was old enough, 18, graduated from high school, moved to San Diego, spent a decade there, went to graduate school in New York, did my PhD at the Stern School. Then moved back across the country to Seattle, Washington, where I was a professor at the Foster School of Business. Met my wife there. After 8 years there, we decided to do something different. As you mentioned, we moved across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris. I spent 5 years as a faculty member at HEC Paris. And then after 5 years there, we moved back across the ocean, not back to the US, but to Canada, to Montreal. Where, as you said, I was a strategy professor and associate dean at the business school at Desautels, faculty of management. And then after 6 years in Montreal, we decided to come back to the United States to where I am today, which is the Price College of Business at the University of Oklahoma. So I'm the dean of the college here, which basically means I'm the chief executive officer. I'm responsible for all the business operations of the college. So just like any business, we run it as a P&L. Yeah, we're in sort of a unique environment in higher education, but we face the same challenges, I think, that any business does.
That's great. Thanks. And I'm curious, like I was telling you before, and I'm glad that you explained it, like what does a dean do, right? In the restaurant industry, a lot of us don't have, very big academic backgrounds. And that's why a lot of times we're people with not too much focus and like, ooh, a cat, and right, we lose the focus. And so it's good to know that there is that business side. I'm kind of curious, in that role, I'm guessing doesn't leave you much time to teach, or do you get to still teach a bit?
Well, I can, and it's important that I do because it's like any business. I mean, you don't want to get too far removed from the operations, right? The interactions with customers. Now, I know if I use the term customer, some of my colleagues cringe and like they're students. Well, no, it's a business, so yeah. To a great extent they are customers, right? So you don't want to lose that. So yeah. I'm not teaching this semester primarily because we just moved. And as I've been telling everybody that asks me when they say, how's it going? I say, well, I'm drinking from a fire hose and trying not to drown because there's just so much information coming at me. You put on top of that the pandemic that we're in, which adds a whole nother level of complexity and challenges. So it's a great challenge. It's a great experience, but it is a business, right? We have revenue, we have costs, we need to be economically sustainable. So we need to think in terms of P&L. We need to think in terms of customers and offerings and value propositions and go-to-market strategy. The same thing that any organization has to think about.
For sure. I mean, I'm sure that there's that whole aspect of marketing and attraction, right? Why would I choose that school over another one?
Yeah.
I mean, based in Canada. I'm in Canada. You were here for a few years. We're lucky with the school system we have here, but we all know, in the U.S. where you're now, like, it's very costly to attend college, university. So I guess you want to be the one that they choose, and again, so there's that whole aspect of the perception and the culture and everything. I'm sure that's related to that, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's competition, right? To your point, there's a lot of choice in the United States for higher education, for colleges of business. So why are they going to come here to the Price College of Business, and why not go somewhere else? So yeah, we have to be able to articulate a value proposition for potential students. Otherwise, we're not going to attract enough.
Yep. And totally makes sense that while you're setting down and you're setting up that you may not teach this semester, but I would have thought from seeing you teach that it would have been a shame if you weren't going to teach anymore. So I'm glad to know that you're still going to get to do that. You made a really good point talking about a water hose and basically trying to adapt to what you're doing is like drinking from a fire hose. In our industry, talking about restaurants, it's pretty much what we live every day. Right, from especially in COVID, but even before that, right, from the cook that calls in sick to there's a leak in the bathroom, to I need to place an order, they open the door, somebody calls in sick in the front as well, and staff shortages and all that stuff. It's basically a very dizzying environment, and a lot of time people have good intention in our business to organize and structure it and manage it. A lot of restaurants, let's not hide it, are not run as tightly as a lot of businesses are, because people that come in, low barrier to entry to come and do it.
Yep.
And a lot of people do it out of passion, but not necessarily out of experience of managing businesses. But what are some of the techniques or stuff that you've applied trying to drink from that water house without drowning or without getting all that water up your nose? What are some of the strategies that you do that maybe we can share with some of the people watching this, that, to make sure that you get organized and that there's the old saying, how do you eat an elephant, is, one bite at a time, but how have you approached it in that new role?
It's a great question, and it's something I'm really sensitive to, partially because it relates to my background in terms of teaching and consulting. But it's very easy, I think, to be all consumed by the daily operational challenges, especially those things that are unanticipated, like you said, the toilet backing up or the chef calling in sick or things like that. I mean, those things are always going to happen, right? And so they create this sense of urgency, and it's really easy, I think, to fall into the trap of sort of focusing only on the urgent, and as a result, sort of losing sight of what's important. And to me, the important things are really more the strategic priorities. And the challenge that I'm facing really sort of on a daily basis, and I feel it very carefully, is am I balancing those two issues sufficiently well? In other words, am I allocating enough time and attention to current operations, current challenges? But am I also carving out enough time that is focused on the future? And I feel this sort of tension every day. So I've got this list of sort of strategic priorities that I'm developing for the college. And these are priorities around changing incentive systems or developing a thought leadership program for our faculty, to thinking about launching new programs, so new offerings. So I got to make sure I allocate enough time and attention. So basically what I do is I schedule it into my calendar. And so my personal assistant, she knows that time is sacred, and it's time for me to sort of sometimes it's alone time, but really sort of just take stock and think about these strategic priorities, and then think about what has to be done to execute on those strategic priorities. So, right, I'm trying to balance the sort of the very short term and the much longer term. And again, I want to make sure that one doesn't swamp out the other, and getting that balance right is a daily struggle.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of the I'm trying to find it as I'm talking to you to see if we could share it with people watching us. But I don't know if you've ever heard of well, I'm sure you have, but if our listeners have heard of the 4 quadrants from Stephen Covey.
Yeah.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I think that's a great point, is that a lot of times we spend, basically the quadrant shows, important, urgent, and then there's like the stuff you don't want to touch at the bottom. But
right.
Especially, as I was saying before, in restaurants, we spend a lot of time in the urgent, not necessarily important stuff. That is like stuff that fall, little fires that we need to put out daily, but that keeps us from moving to the quadrant that's important and not urgent, right? We deal with the important, urgent, but not necessarily with the important, not urgent, which is, as you said, strategic priorities and where you want to go and to plan it out. And I think a lot of times it's something that's maybe in the culture of maybe larger businesses or different organizations, but in our business, we're not very good at getting a bird's eye view of our business and seeing, I say work on the business instead of in the business, right? We're busy every day working in the business, but working on the business allows us to get an outside view of what we're doing, how we're performing, how we can do things better. So thanks for sharing that. That's definitely, and I love you said schedule it in, right? Once it's scheduled in, we say it in our daily lives, right? If you're not going to the gym, well, make sure that you pencil it in, you put it in the calendar, you'll make sure that you hit it, because otherwise, if you just wait to be in the mood and for it to fit, especially for those of us that have kids, it'll never happen, right? So very good point in saying schedule it in and make time, because if you don't make time to plan, life will plan it for you, and you're not necessarily going to wind up where you want to go, right? So right. I really appreciate that. Also, one thing I want to bring up with you, in the classes that I had a chance to do with you, you talked a lot about innovation and where businesses go, how incumbents, which are, for those of us, I learned that word probably in your class, but incumbents are large companies that are already established and already doing a large chunk of the market. But then you come in as a smaller company, and how are you going to be innovative and all that? Now in our industry, innovation is quite. Especially when it comes to tech, we're pretty late on tech in the restaurant industry. And I read a stat that really, flabbergasted me, just to use a big word, but that said that 80% of investments in the restaurant industry towards tech was done just to upkeep old systems. So 20%, and those are probably done by larger chains, are done to use tech that are going to help us move forward. Now I know in the last 6 months with the current crisis, a lot of that has been accelerated, times 10. But I'm curious to get your like from your point of view and some of the stuff you've done when it comes to innovation. And obviously there's reasons why big companies don't move fast, because they don't need the actually, I'll let you tell us that. But why are some of the reasons that incumbents or big companies don't move towards innovation, or why it takes them, some of them that sleep on it, why do they react too late? And what are some of the reasons? Because I'm sure that some of that can be applied to our industry as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's sort of, sometimes it's called the incumbent syndrome. It's a syndrome because there's a whole bunch of underlying factors that contribute to it. But I think at the base of it, it sort of goes back to what I was just talking about in terms of my daily life as a senior leader in an organization. It's where do I allocate my time? So that's really a question individually. But if you sort of scale that up and you say, okay, across the organization, we've got a core business. And if everyone falls into the trap or the temptation of thinking that we got to focus on the here and now, right, then nobody's really thinking about the future. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that organizations do as they mature that really focus managers and staff to focus on the present. So incentives tend to have relatively short-term time horizons. So for example, if you're a publicly traded company, everybody's concerned about quarterly results and annual results. So what that is saying is that managers are focused on 3 months out and a year out, and not much beyond that. Okay. Now, if I'm focused on short-term results, the question is, well, what are the metrics that I'm measured by? Well, it's profitability. Okay. So how do I maximize short-term profitability? Well, if I'm thinking about that and I've got basically $1 to spend on something that's going to be quote unquote innovative, something that's going to improve operations, it's probably going to be trying to tweak our existing operations in our existing business with our existing business model, rather than do something that might prepare us for the future. So the time horizon of mature organizations is short term. The metrics that they use tend to be focused on the bottom line. And again, if it's focused on the bottom line, I'm going to get a quicker return on that dollar spend in my core business by finding areas of operational efficiency than if I took that dollar and started to think about maybe investing it in a radically new technology or developing potentially a different core business. Those things are very uncertain. The payoff is going to be far into the future, which means in the short run, they're not going to be profitable. Okay. Now there's a fourth thing that makes incumbents focus much more on the present, which really creates a window of opportunity for startups, which I'll speak about hopefully here in a minute. The fourth thing is I have marketing colleagues, and they like to say that rule number one in marketing is listen to your customer. And that's great. But if you're an incumbent, right, and you've had the same customers for years, if not decades, and you listen to them, they're going to tell you things like, your restaurant would be a lot better if you tweaked the menu this way, or if you added potentially these menu items, or if you allowed me a greater degree of customization. These are all things that are going to make you, as the operator of the business, focused on your existing business and trying to refine it marginally, the operations, the offering for your core customer. In other words, your existing customers focus your attention, which means you're not paying attention to things that are happening outside your existing customer base. And let's face it, that's one of the things that often drives innovation. If my customers are 40 plus years and older individuals, I need to be concerned about what are teenagers doing, especially when it comes to the food service industry, right? What are their tastes? What are their preferences? How do they think about the consumption of food? How do they think about the distribution model of food? How do they think about what they want as ingredients in the food? It's probably going to be different from that 40 plus year old crowd that has the discretionary income, that is sort of the typical traditional core customer for dine-in experience restaurants. So if I'm listening to those folks and I'm not paying attention to sort of the future demographic, if I'm not paying attention to them, somebody may be, and that may be a startup. And the startup may develop a business model and a set of offerings that are fundamentally different from the incumbents. And then the incumbents, if they face such a startup that's maybe pursuing a different business model, they've got a classic challenge to face. Can I and my same company do two fundamentally different things? Can I focus on my core business, my core customers, focus on short-term profitability? But can I also build alongside that a different business focused on different customers, possibly using different technologies than my mature core business? Can I do both of these things at the same time inside the same organization? And this is really challenging to do for mature organizations. And what tends to happen is they often choose to focus on their mature core business at the expense of innovation. So if they don't do it, there's a vacuum. Who's going to fill that vacuum? It's going to be one of two types of organizations. It's going to be a startup that doesn't have the legacy and the baggage of the incumbent, or it's going to be somebody coming in from a different industry. And food service is a great example of this. Let's think about the sort of the delivery model. The traditional delivery model was in person. You went to the restaurant and they delivered it. Right now, what happened? That started to change with the rise of, for example, Uber. So Uber had entered the ride-sharing platform, and then they said, hey, we can use our same underlying technology, our fleet of drivers, to penetrate the delivery market, the fast delivery market for food, right? So they didn't come from within the restaurant industry. They came from very far outside the restaurant industry, and now they are invading part of that industry. And in some ways, this is good for food service companies, but in some ways, this has been bad. This has been essentially, it's impacted the bottom line of food service companies. So that's what I mean by a diversifying entrance, a company that's not in the same business as the incumbents, but they see an opportunity that the incumbents are missing, and they enter the business that way.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. And I think, what we can gather in our industry is that a lot of times, I guess, one of the lines that always scares me is, why are you doing this? Because it's always been done this way.
Yeah.
But there's really good reasons why, which you've explained now, is that it's not easy, because everybody, you didn't mention, but that's kind of, under the story here, is also that not only is not our core business, but it's going to require a lot of change inside our current business, but not just to the business, but to the people, right? And I guess that's a big, I was going to ask you also about the risk of changing and that's something we've lived, with Piecemeal and software and all that. Well, we've been using this for years. Everybody's comfortable with it. The risk a lot of times in changing, whether for tech or for something else, but the problem is not just with the price or how much is this going to cost us, but a lot of times it's the learning curve of our team changing habits of our team, because I've seen it in restaurants where we went from one POS to another. I mean, a POS, you go in, point of service, you punch in the food, you get the bill out, but it was not the same user interface, and the training, and people were complaining. The other one used to do this one doesn't do that, right? So there's that. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the risks or basically challenges that people have in adopting other things that's not just cost related? It's not, a lot of times it's not about money, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love the way you teed it up. That's sort of a fifth element of the incumbent syndrome that I was talking about earlier, right? So in addition to being short-term focused on profitability and efficiency in existing customers, let's look inside the organization. Inside the organization, we got a group of people, right? These people have invested in developing certain skill sets. Now, if we're going to innovate, what might happen is the value of those skill sets may be questionable. In other words, we're going to ask people to learn how to do new things. And sometimes, as we all know, that's really challenging. So I'm going to give you two stories to sort of illustrate this point. And Chris, you probably know one I'm going to tell because it's about Kodak. Because the near demise of Kodak was partially due to exactly what you're talking about. And the way I'm going to focus this story on a group of people that worked inside Kodak. So if you go back in time, Kodak was one of the most profitable firms on the planet. So they were near monopoly in film and disposable cameras, right? Then along came digital imaging, which, as many people know, Kodak invented, but they were extremely slow to commercialize. And here again is the example of, I've got a core business of film. I've built a bunch of resources and customers in that. I've also invented this new technology. So I have the opportunity to commercialize this. What Kodak did not do is they didn't do it quickly, which allowed a window of opportunity for startups to come in and other entrants like Sony, for example, to come in. Part of the problem that Kodak faced was the core business was film. In order to innovate in film, you need people that have expertise in surface chemistry. And these people are organic chemists. So at one point in time, Kodak employed Kodak and Fujifilm, the largest group of organic chemists outside of the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, now let's go back to 1975. I picked 75 because that's the year that a Kodak engineer at the headquarters in Rochester, New York, invented something that he called the film-less camera. It was the world's first digital camera. It was a camera that did not require film. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of an organic chemist who has spent her or his career working for Kodak, and you learn that a colleague of yours has invented a device that will make your skill set obsolete.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? Are you going to say, oh, I guess my career is over? No, you're probably going to fight tooth and nail against this. And this is what happened. There was extreme fear on the part of organic chemists and other people inside Kodak that their jobs would be made obsolete if Kodak aggressively, quickly moved into commercialized digital imaging technology. So they pushed back. There were other groups in Kodak, largely the middle managers, who pushed back not so much because they were concerned about their career prospects. What they were concerned about was their skill sets did not carry over into digital imaging. There were different customers, different technologies. It was a fundamentally different business model. It was a business model based upon the sale of hardware, where the gross margins were much smaller than the gross margins in film. So a lot of the middle managers said, why are we doing this, right? We're going to make less money. We don't know who we're competing with. It's a technology that we don't really understand. And hey, you know what? I'm 55 years old. I'm going to retire in 5 years. I don't want to do this. This is just going to take too much effort. So they resisted the change, which ultimately nearly killed Kodak. Okay, now, does that happen to all companies that try to move from sort of one technology, one core business to another? Absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do it. No, there are lots of examples of companies that can. I would say the company that has done it the longest is Nokia. So if you go back to Nokia, back to the mid-1800s, Nokia started out as basically, first as a timber mill, right? And they went from basically being a timber mill to a developer of rubber cladding for electrical cables, then into consumer electronics like televisions, ultimately into telecommunications, into wireless handsets, and so on. So they've made this sort of transition from multiple different core businesses over time. The second example I want to give you really quick, because it's a salient one, because it's happening right now at OU. Universities, higher education, are facing essentially a huge challenge. And it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. And this is the challenge of in-person learning versus online learning. Now, the world went through a shock back in anywhere from December to March in terms of the rise of COVID. As a result, many universities around the world pivoted very, very fast to online. And they didn't do it very well because they had very little experience with it. But that helped overcome a lot of inertia that existed inside universities with respect to online learning. If I were to talk to my colleagues anywhere in the world last year about, hey, you interested in teaching an online class? They would look at me and say, why? I don't want to teach online learning. There's no need for me. I don't know anything about it. I don't have the skill set. I don't have the time and energy to invest in it. I don't know anything about 3-point lighting and green screens and Zoom. And it's just a lot easier doing what I know how to do. Well, the pandemic has changed that. Now we've quickly shifted. Now, one of the things that we're doing at OU is we just announced 3 weeks ago a brand new umbrella brand called OU Online. So we are going to have two different businesses sit side by side in the same enterprise. We're going to have our traditional in-person education business, and we're going to have the business called OU Online that represents all of our online delivered programs. And we are facing the same sort of internal challenges that I have just described to you. We've got challenges of, well, gosh, it's going to take us a while to become profitable in that business. Do we really want to do this, right? If we spent a buck on improving in-person education, we might get a quicker return than if we go online. The one thing that we're not facing, and this has largely been the result of the pandemic, is we're not facing that big internal resistance from faculty. Because now we've got a critical mass of faculty that say, you know what? I know how to do online learning. I see the value of it, and I'm willing to continue to improve my skill set so I can deliver that. That's going to really help jumpstart this new business, this new online business, which uses a very different distribution model. It has a very different economic model than what our core business of in-person learning does. So again, it's sort of a very recent example. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the prospect of OU Online.
That's very cool. And I'm guessing, I mean, signs of the times, but yeah, you know, you're going there. Do you think, I mean, from what you've all said now, I've got about 42 notes, so I think we're going to be here for the whole day. But I'm kidding. You said, obviously, the crisis and what people have learned the last 6 months have helped them not push back too much. But a lot of times, whatever the case may be, when you do have large changes, especially the one you're doing now with OU Online is a big one. What are some, as a leader, the role you're in, but anybody running a business as not necessarily always like to tell people there's two hats. You have the owner hat is one, but the leader hat is a different one, right? People can do things because you tell them to, but as a leader, you want them to buy into it and you want to make sure they understand. But what are some of the tips or some of the ways that you can sell that point? Because there is a way, and you gave the idea of the example of Kodak. Then you mentioned Nokia that did all kinds of things, and there's other companies. A lot of them, in my mind right now, are Japanese, but that they do motorcycles and TVs and in different branches and have branched out in different things. But what are some, as a leader, some of the things I can do to help my team understand where we're headed and buy into it, even though it might not be right away and it might take a certain amount of time? But what are some of the ways that I can try to sell the idea that we're trying to do things? I was talking about changing a POS before. I believe a lot of the stuff that we do, obviously comes back to communication, but what do you think, or what are you as a leader, some of the things that you try to do when you meet in that faculty? There's probably some that are more resistant than others. How do you try to make them see the light or see the opportunities that are there that they may not see?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, this question is really the question of change management, right? So if you think you need to do something differently, how do you get the entire organization to see it too and be motivated to pursue it? And there's a variety of tools sort of in the area of change management. It's a whole sort of area of academic study.
Yeah.
But my approach, because I take your challenge in my sector of higher education to the extreme. Higher education is populated by cats, and my job is to basically be the chief cat herder. What are cats? They're super independently minded. They're autonomous. They act like they don't need anybody. These are faculty members. Faculty members have tremendous expertise. They have tremendous autonomy in their job. We use basically outcome metrics in academia, right? So publications, patents, things like that. As a result, we really don't care how you do your job. Just as long as you hit these outcomes, do it however you want to do it. So we've got people that view themselves as extremely competent and expert, which, let's face it, there's a downside to that. They think they know it all. And the second thing is they're accustomed to a tremendous amount of autonomy over how they do their job. So when someone like me comes in and says, hey, everybody, I think we need a new strategy. In other words, I think we need to have a different aspiration or a different vision. And I think we're going to have to change what we do in order to get to that vision. If in this setting, I use that approach, a top-down approach, it would be dead on arrival, okay? So change management lesson number one is if you're working in an organization where people sort of have this sense of expertise and the sense of autonomy, is any sort of top-down directive command and control approach will not work. You have to go sort of the other way, which is a much more bottom-up, participative, inclusive approach. Because what you're really trying to do with respect to change management is, you said it, you're trying to create buy-in, right? The cynical person would say, oh, this is a co-opt strategy. In other words, if you are involved in setting the vision, then I have co-opted you. You've drunk the Kool-Aid, you're now bought in. And that's exactly right. So part of the change management process, when it comes to strategy, when it comes to thinking about strategically reorienting your business, changing some element of the business model, has to be this idea of buy-in. And part of getting buy-in is having a participative strategy setting process. So that's one thing, right? So you want people to feel like their voice has been heard while you're setting the new direction and you're setting the initiatives that need to be put in place to get there, right? And that's the one thing I'm going to start doing. In fact, the executive committee, my leadership team, we're going to start working on a structured strategic planning process a little bit later in the fall here. And it's going to be very inclusive. Faculty will be involved, staff will be involved, students will be involved, alumni will be involved, other parts of the university will be involved, because we need that engagement for buy-in, but also for insight, for expertise. Strategy setting from the top down sort of assumes that the leader has all the information, right, and is sort of the sharpest tool in the shed, so to speak, which is fundamentally not true, right? There are people that know way more about a variety of things here at OU than I do. It would be naive and arrogant of me to say I know best. So you want to leverage that sort of knowledge, that expertise, and you're going to get a better solution. You're going to get a better strategy. Then you got to communicate. And this is something that I am really, really strongly an advocate for, especially in current times of a pandemic. There's a temptation in a crisis for the leadership team to sort of close ranks, pull in, become really sort of myopic, really, really short-term focused, but non-communicative. You got to do the opposite, right? In other words, you've got to be communicating all the time, and it has to be creating opportunities for two-way communication. Because what people want when they're faced with uncertainty, if there's a vacuum of information, they're going to make stuff up. Rumors are going to circulate. People will start telling stories that don't have any sort of basis in fact. Fear will take over and the organization will come to a crunching halt. So one of the things that I started to do not long after I started is I have every week, same day, same time, a virtual town hall meeting with every faculty and staff member. And it's basically an ask us anything meeting, right? And so I usually give a few updates at the very beginning, and then anybody can ask anything. Now, the first meeting, everybody was a little cautious. I was the new guy, right? They've never done this before. But now people feel really comfortable and they feel empowered. And it's opened up the line of communications. not just in that meeting. I'm getting more emails now from people, right? They feel more comfortable approaching me and other members of the senior leadership team. So communication, especially in times of crisis, but even more, or I should say as much in terms of strategic change, you've got to communicate. So broad communication, frequent communication, in-depth communication. You've got to operate on incentives and ability. I have this fairly simple way I think about human performance. It comes down to your motivation and it comes down to your skills. If you're going to try to change an organization to move it towards, let's say, a new business model, you got to ask yourself, do we have the right incentives to do this? In other words, are people going to be motivated to say, yeah, I'm willing to engage in that new initiative? So that might mean you need to change your incentives. The second thing you're probably going to need to change is ability. The Kodak problem was a lot of people didn't think they had the skills to succeed in the brave new world of digital imaging. A failure of leadership in Kodak was to recognize that and then to put in place development training programs that would address that skills issue. So you got to address the motivation piece. You got to address the skills issue, because oftentimes innovation requires people doing different things, which means they need different skills. So we got to focus on incentives and ability. So these are just a few of the pieces of sort of a strategic change effort to help increase the chances of success.
Beautiful. Love it. Just to recap a few things you said in there. I love how you said, I brought out these town halls first when people were shy, then they opened up. One thing I hope everybody that's watching this gets out of that is that you fostered that, though. You brought that, you allowed that to happen, which can be very scary as a leader, because you put yourself out there saying, ask me anything. You will get questions that you don't like. And I've seen it recently, even just to give example, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook does these town halls with employees, and I've seen some questions where he looked a little bit like a deer in headlights and was not necessarily, very ready to answer them. But you have to trust that your business, that you're comfortable enough with your plan and where you're headed, that you can take that. And even if that means not necessarily losing faith, but not necessarily knowing all the answers, but showing vulnerability enough to take that. So I think that's really important that you've allowed that. Another thing I really like is you said faculty members are very independent. So that's an extreme case for you. And I think that applies beautifully to restaurants, because there's probably in smaller businesses, not rarely an environment where you get more misfits and warriors in the restaurant industry that are basically gun for hires, like bartenders, servers, even kitchen guys. They'll jump from restaurant to another. They don't like what's on the menu one night, they may step out and go somewhere else, right? There's so many restaurants, there's so many opportunities, especially in the last couple of years. So being able to, and I think that's a really good point when you say top-down approach, is basically me telling you what to do because I'm the boss. But if you go bottom up, and that's always the way I, as a leader, and especially in our industry, I've approached it, is to say, listen, I need to know what I'm trying to sell as an idea here, and I need to find the way to sell that vision to different people in my team. Because in a restaurant, for example, the service team is usually very different than the kitchen team. What they want, schedule-wise, job-wise, incentive-wise, all that is very different, right? The motivations for what motivates them and what keeps them interested is different front of house than back of house. So as a leader, I love that when you say, and I see it when I see an owner go in and say, we're changing this and we're going to do it this way. And I say, listen, if you don't explain why, and you don't explain why this is beneficial for them in the business, they're not going to buy into it, right? So I love how you say that, there, especially in environments like, I wouldn't have thought of it, but like a faculty or a restaurant where people are very independent thinkers and very used to moving job to job, traveling in between jobs and doing all kinds of stuff. If they don't believe in the vision and what you're trying to sell them and why we're changing, that it's not just change for change, or even if they don't need it to have it shoved down their throat, is what I mean, especially because there is volatility and high turnover in our business. Is, as a leader, you want to make sure that there is that communication. And it's funny I loved your town hall. I've always said that I do this, obviously, open door policy and come and talk to me, and I want your questions, but also I've always done it and suggested to my clients in consulting, sit down with everybody at least once every 3 months And in your case, that might not be possible because there's too many people. But in a restaurant where you have 40, 50, 60 team members, make sure you have that, off the record talk every 3 months. How is it going? What are you liking? What's going on? And you're going to get so much feedback from what's going on in your business that you're going to learn a lot from that. So I really appreciate that point.
Great point. It's you really get two benefits. You get more upward information. That's a challenge of leadership in any organization, is that you open with this when you were talking about teaching. That's one way to sort of stay connected to what's happening at the front line. Another way is to try to create a sense of comfort in people to speak up, to share information upwards in the hierarchy of the organization. And that has benefits, right? Because all human beings have blinders on, and leaders do too, right? So the more that we can get that information from different parts of the organization, the wider sort of our peripheral vision is of the organization. But it also has that motivating effect. People feel connected because they feel valued. And I love the analogy you made to your industry. Your industry there's a bit of sort of this notion of free agency, right? I'm a free agent, all right? I'm an expert, and I'm super mobile, so I'm going to go where I want to go. In academia, it's sort of the same way. So how do you overcome that? You got to transcend that notion of free agency and make people feel connected to your organization. And again, communication, bilateral communication, making people feel like they're part of the process, their voice matters, is a really important way to make people identify with the organization. That's going to affect motivation. That's going to affect retention, which is clearly, I know it's a challenge in your business, right? Retention costs are really, really high because there's such rapid turnover that goes on inside the organization. And the last thing I want to emphasize is something you said, which is super important, which is, if you're going to do this, you are going to put yourself in a position as a leader of being vulnerable. You're going to put yourself in a position of having to say occasionally or frequently, I don't know the answer. And a lot of leaders don't like to do that because they feel like the reason they got into that position in the first place is because they do know, they have expertise. And for them to say, that's a great question. Honestly, I don't know the answer, but we're going to figure it out together, or I'm going to find the answer for you. I've been saying that exact phrase a lot because I'm an outsider. I'm the new guy, right? So people are asking me stuff I honestly don't know. But what's really valuable is when you admit that you don't know, but also that you will find the information and you will get it to that person or everybody that's interested as fast as possible. Because again, that creates more of a sense of we rather than this sort of sense of me. And I think that's the challenge in higher education. That's the challenge in the restaurant, the food service industry.
Very, very great point. And yeah, totally. That the old syndrome of the manager that's, I know everything and I have the answer, talking manager in our industry, but leader anywhere. But people feel like they're so vulnerable if they say that they don't know. But a lot of times it just opens up communication. And I keep telling people, your staff know your business better than you, in certain cases. There's a lot of stuff in the back end and the finances, but when it comes to your customers, when it comes to your guests, in our case, when it comes to how it operates, a lot of times there's stuff that if you had listened, you would have heard it on the floor, as we call in a restaurant, 3 months, 6 months before it happened, right? And that's where I love the point you made when I talk about those impromptu chats or off the record chats with the staff. When you say information is going to come up, I tell people in a restaurant, that's when you know who's going out with who in the business, who's going on vacation next summer and not coming back, who's going to that's how I found out what was going to happen in my restaurant 3 to 6 months in advance, is by having these conversations, because then people feel like they're not just a number as well, right? You're taking that time to have the conversation with them. In your case, because it's bigger, you do it, as a town hall, but they have a forum to express concerns or questions and stuff like that. And the other thing I think it brings is that it allows you, in the message you hear in some of the concerns, to address them way before they become bigger problems, right? A lot of times it allows you to say, nip it in the bud, but basically say, oh, I see this is coming, maybe I should address this, and explain why we're going that way. Because a lot of times a small idea, and we've all done it, a small thing that we're nervous about becomes this huge thing in our head if we don't, address it over a few days. But the same thing happens in our organization. So very cool to chat about that part of leadership with you. I want to go back a little bit because I think it's a very good point. When you talked about Kodak, there's an example that came to me that I've heard years ago, that the carburetor industry that didn't adapt when fuel injection came in the early 80s, and the record industry when CDs came on board, and like some of these industries that vanished, and Kodak was a great example. One thing I've always wondered, and it's funny now because I never imagined myself that I'd be running a company that could one day IPO and be publicly traded. We'll see where Piecemeal goes in the next 5 years, but obviously when you have a startup that has the potential to scale, that's a possibility. I worked a couple of times in my life for publicly traded companies, and I hated the fact that it was so short-term vision, which you mentioned before. And I'm curious to hear you on some of the companies that don't have that short-term vision, right? Because when I worked, I felt like it was just focused on the next quarter and those results, and there was no plan even for a year ahead or 2 years ahead. And even me back then, 20 years ago, as a customer service agent, I was like, this is not going to work in 24 months. How are these CFOs, CEOs, and all these people not seeing this coming? But the only example that comes to mind, and you may have more, but Amazon is one that I've always wondered. In the early years, they did books, and then they reinvested everything and then went to electronics. And it seems like that company was very good at not necessarily staying where they're at and growing that, but you're reusing these profits and all that, but being at, and I guess maybe because they were a startup back then, but they've always, it seemed to me like they were good at seeing long term, to bringing them, took them 20, 25 years to get to where they're at today. But in the early 2000s, I didn't know much about business, but I kept reading magazines that said, Amazon's still not profitable, still losing money. But I guess they had a long-term vision. It happens in the publicly traded side, but it's rare, right? But
it's a great question. It's a complex question. I love the fact that you brought it up. So I'm gonna make an attempt to address it here. And again, I'll use Amazon and I'll use Kodak as sort of polar opposite points of view. But part of the problem being a publicly traded company, especially in the United States and Canada, is there's this idea, and there's research to support it, that investors in this part of the world tend to be relatively short-sighted. In other words, they're focused on very short-term returns. And that cannot help but get communicated through the board of directors and other channels to the senior leadership of the organization. And you often see it reflected in, for example, the compensation packages of senior executives, right? So they'll often be there'll be options which are tied to stock price, right? Reaching a certain level within a certain time period, and that time period tends to be relatively short. So again, the capitalism that exists in North America often sort of puts pressure on firms that are publicly traded to be sort of short-sighted. My favorite example of this is Kodak. So we know the story about Kodak, right? They invented the digital camera, but they were really slow to commercializing it, allowed an opportunity for others to come in, dominate the market, almost killed Kodak. Well, one of the reasons why, part of this sort of incumbent syndrome that you're describing, is a player that's critical in publicly traded firms. These are security analysts, right? So these are the folks that are basically researching companies' stock and then issuing recommendations on buy, sell, or hold. So back in 1994, a security analyst who was basically analyzing, part of his portfolio was Kodak. So analyzing Kodak stock, said this in a report that he wrote. I'm going to sort of paraphrase it because I don't remember exactly what it was, but he basically said the following: Kodak should stop squandering shareholders' money on digital nonsense. So what was he saying? He was saying to the senior leadership and pretty much the world that don't go into digital. Yeah. That's you're wasting shareholders' money by doing that. Stick to what you know. Stick to film. Now, this is 1994. This is 19 years after Kodak has invented the world's first digital camera. It's 12 years after Sony announces Mavica, the world's first consumer digital camera. So even then, you had a representative of shareholders putting pressure on senior leaders in Kodak to, look, don't innovate. Focus on film, okay? Now, Amazon is a great exception. We learn by exceptions to the rule. For me, the rule is incumbents that fall prey to the incumbent syndrome and either die or become a shadow of their former selves, like Kodak, right? Worst case, you become Polaroid, you die, or Blockbuster, you die. Amazon's a great counterexample. So to your point, publicly traded firm, but they have had this great willingness and ability to experiment with all sorts of new technologies and new business models. And there's a whole host of reasons behind this, but I think one of the primary reasons behind this was Jeff Bezos. The way that you propose essentially an experiment inside Amazon is there's a template, and it's basically a 2-page template. So you don't have to come with this giant PowerPoint deck and these pro forma financials and all this stuff. It's pretty simple. It's like sort of the core elements of the business model. And then there's essentially financial resources that are set aside for these experiments, right? And that's important because we know that, look, go back to my example. If I've got $1 and I've got a short-term profitability goal, I'm probably going to invest that $1 in something that I know how to do really well, my core business, right? I'm probably not going to give that $1 to someone that says, hey, we can use our servers that we have built, our data centers that we have built to support our online retail business to actually provide data center storage for third parties, right? Which at the time people thought that's just stupid. If you go back to when S3, sort of the first iteration of Amazon AWS was announced, they took a whole bunch of heat in the media for doing this. And to Bezos' credit, because it was just like Kodak, Bezos said, I don't care. What he had the willingness and the ability to do, and this I think had a lot to do with the fact that he was a very big shareholder and still is in the company, he pushed back against the shareholder community, right? He said, I have no aspirations to be profitable right now, right? We want to build something sustainable for the long term, and we need to experiment to do that. So we shouldn't be obsessed with short-term profitability. So they had this willingness and this ability to pursue experiments with all sorts of different things, some of which succeeded, like AWS, some of which failed, right, miserably. But I think that's the key for incumbents is if you don't have that ability and that motivation to experiment with innovative ideas, whether those are new technologies, new products, or new business models, you're never going to be able to adapt and survive. And let's face it, this is what you in your company, Piecemeal, is good at. You guys experiment. Why? You don't have the baggage of a Kodak. You guys, if you want to do something quick, try it out, you can do it because the risk is much smaller, right? So again, this is why you often see incumbents, they don't do experimentation. Startups are really good at experimentation. So what happens? Well, a stylized fact is incumbents are sort of one-hit wonders. They build a core business, it's successful. The world changes, they don't adapt. Diversifying entrants come in, kill them off, they go away. So this is the notion of creative destruction, right?
Yep.
So Amazon, the impressive thing is this ability, even to this day, to be willing to invest in a whole bunch of crazy ideas and support that experimental mindset, rather than say, no, we know what our core business are. We're going to focus on just maximizing profitability from those businesses.
AWS was what, 10, 12 years ago, maybe? I don't know if it's longer than that.
No, well, so I was an early beta user of S3, and this would have been before I left Seattle, so 2007.
Okay, so pretty early. But it's funny to see like how you say how he pushed back against the community, which a lot of times the leaders don't want to do. In this case, he was a bigger shareholder, but I mean, AWS is a huge part of Amazon's business today. Like,
yeah, and it started because of a small scale experiment. Like, we've got these resources we've already built. We're not using them to capacity. Is there another thing that we can use to generate revenue? You know, we face this in higher education. Restaurants are the same way. Yeah, you've got variable costs, right? That's food cost, and that's huge. I mean, I know the food service companies live and die by food costs, right? But you've also got these fixed costs, right? Facilities, right? The restaurant itself, the equipment, and the people. And let's face it, if we look just on a daily basis, the capacity utilization of food service in terms of their fixed costs, it's like this. There are these peaks, but the rest of the time, they're sitting empty, they're sitting idle. So, okay, how could we better deploy, make more efficient use of these fixed cost assets? That was sort of the question that Amazon asked with respect to its data centers. One way to innovate in the food service business is to ask the same thing. During the downtime of our fixed cost assets, is there some alternative use that we can use to generate revenue that we might be able to have a competitive advantage in that business? Lots of businesses do this, right? This is why Fujifilm, which was a primary competitor to Kodak, this is why they survived. For me, again, I go back to the Kodak story, so I'll do it really quick. Two companies, same business, dominant players in their respective geographies, Kodak in North America, Fujifilm in Japan. Both facing the same threat, digital imaging, responded fundamentally different. Kodak said, digital imaging is bad, we're scared of it, so what are we going to do? We're going to defend the core business. Fujifilm said, digital imaging, cool, let's explore it. They were the first company in Japan to introduce a consumer digital camera. They actually beat Sony to market by a year. But the other thing they did was they looked at their technological assets and they said, where else can we create and capture value from these things? So I'm going to give you one extreme example. I mentioned organic chemists. These are the people that are used to sort of innovate in celluloid-based film. Yep. One of the things that happened to celluloid-based film is that through oxidation process, the image, the film starts to erode, okay? So you have to be really good at surface chemistry, and in particular, developing antioxidants to protect the film from the oxidation process. So Fujifilm and Kodak had invented a lot of antioxidants and had patented those things. What Fujifilm said back in the 80s said, where else can we create value from antioxidant technology? One answer was cosmetics. They entered the cosmetics business. Today, it's branded as Astalift. It is sold worldwide, but the foundation for that business were technologies, antioxidation technologies that were developed for the core business of film. So again, one way to innovate is to think about what do we have available, what assets do we have from our core business? Can we find a different use for them and build a business model around them? So again, it's a great, I love the Kodak example.
It applies to so many things. But one thing I like that you mentioned about Amazon before, and in this case, this worked for them, and they used it in a different way, which I think applies to our business, in so many ways. But especially in Amazon's case, they allow themselves to fail. Yeah. Not necessarily to fail will kill the business, but fail on ideas and projects and things. Sometimes if you never try anything out, you'll never get anywhere. You'll never get to try something new. And I think it's attributed to Wayne Gretzky, and I don't even know if it's real, but there's a saying that Wayne Gretzky said, I missed 100% of the shots I didn't take. In a sense that if you never try anything, and if you never, even if it's hard, but there's ways of doing things carefully and all that. So give yourself as an operator the ability to fail and to try different ways and different things. And it applies even go back to leadership. Yeah. I was coaching somebody 2 years ago, and a team that owns a bunch of restaurants. And then they said, we coached one of the managers who had issues on how to get this team to do things. And after the first time, he turned around and said, Wells doesn't know anything. It doesn't work, because he tried the first time. I said, try to approach it a different way. But sometimes you have to give yourself a chance to fail, to try things different, a few times before you get good at it. Because I could suggest a way of approaching a problem, but you're not necessarily going to execute it properly the first time. It might take you 2, 3, 4, 5 times before you get comfortable with it. So allowing yourself to fail is really important, and I think it's a really good point.
Why don't we end on this point? Because I want to pick up on this since we've been talking about innovation. There's a really old saying in the world of corporate innovation and R&D labs. There can be no innovation without experimentation. There can be no experimentation without failure. In other words, failure, as you just said, is fundamental to innovation. Now, this raises the question, the organization, do they tolerate failure? Better yet, do they reward failure? Most organizations, failure is the scarlet letter. It's not A, it's F. If you're associated with a failed project, your reputation is ruined, your career chances are ruined, so no one wants to be associated with failure. If you think about that, then that means that organization isn't going to experiment, isn't going to innovate, eventually may die, right? So it's a great point. But to get that experimentation that leads to innovation, you've got to build in the value of failure, even reward failure, right? And again, teach people how to fail quickly and cheaply, right? We don't want to bet the farm on these experiments. So this is in the world of startups, this is sort of the lean approach to startups, right? Fail fast, fail quickly, fail often, which is another way of saying experiment fast, experiment quickly, or experiment cheaply, experiment often. And that's going to help with innovation.
Corey, I knew this would be interesting, and you and I could probably do this for hours. I know you're a very busy man, so I want to thank you so much for coming on. I wanted to talk about the book. We didn't even get there because there's a ton of value. If you like what you've heard from Corey today, he's the co-author of a book called Cracked It, How to Solve Big Problems and Sell Solutions Like a Top Strategy Consultant. Forget the consultant part. It talks about how to be a better problem solver, which is something that we all live with in our business. You can find it on Amazon. We're talking about Amazon. I was going to share the screen, but I'm sure you can all go and find it there. Corey, it's an honor and a privilege to have you on today. Thank you for your insight. I want to wish you tremendous success. I'm sure you will be successful from what I've seen from you in your new role at OU and the Price Business School. And hope that we get down the line as this show grows to get you back on, and maybe we'll talk about the book then. But thank you so much for your insight. Much appreciated, and talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.